The name Mac, his father said, in excusing himself to his wife, would lend emphasis to his own family's ancient Scottish roots, baked to a crisp in the Georgia sun, then transported to the Mississippi Gulf Coast in 1804, a year after the Louisiana Purchase. Mac, my mother explained to me, was an unusual human male. Now we would simply call Mac McFadden gay, one of the countless gay men who flourish in small southern communities. Back then, he was referred to as being light in the wingtips, a fairy or a flit, or worse. Though actually the locals of Belle Cote didn't talk much about Mac, preferring instead to observe him and roll their eyes. There was, in fact, something magically buoyant about Mac in his heyday. He was a large man, a substantial man, yet so blond and light-skinned that parts of him seemed translucent as he poured tea from my mother and me, and offered us cold biscuits with apple butter and great chunks of sharp cheddar in the weeks following our homecoming. He lived in a sprawling house with floor-to-ceiling windows and 20-foot ceilings, where sunlight splashed the splintery pine floors and shone through the vegetation outside to make leafy patterns against the whitewashed walls. Mac's house sat squarely in the center of town, behind the First Baptist Church. In a previous life, the place had been an 18th century French school for boys and had a wraparound porch he used for entertaining. For what Mac lacked in visitors from Belle Cote, he made up in lavish parties with dozens of guests from New Orleans. Seersuckered men in Panama hats with long, delicate fingers that held glowing cigarillos and pearl-tipped mouthpieces. Beautiful men, said my mother, her breath catching in her throat. On Saturday nights, they cavorted until all hours as the sounds of Benny Goodman and Ella Fitzgerald mingled with the moans and groans of the Holy Rollers on the edge of town. Some Sunday mornings, the guests' cars were still there to shock the prim-faced Baptists on their way to Sunday school. Mac was brilliant, my mother said, a physicist by training, a Harvard Ph.D. He'd been stationed at the Pentagon during the war, ferrying top-secret equations, many his own, back and forth between Los Alamos National Labs in New Mexico and the Pentagon. Afterward, when the war turned cold, Hiroshima and Nagasaki weighed heavily on his conscience, and he returned to Belle Cote and went to work for Ingalls Shipbuilding, which built nuclear-powered submarines. This eased his conscience only minimally, and in 1951, he quit, just 2 years before he would have been fired anyhow, given that Eisenhower would soon sign Executive Order 10450 that prohibited those practicing sexual perversion from working for the government or its defense contractors. Fortunately for Mac, art was his second love after physics. This was as it should be, he was fond of saying, the two being obverse reflections of each other. An art gallery in his Mississippi Gulf Coast hometown seemed just the ticket and, if not redemptive, at least relatively harmless. Some of this information I learned from Mac himself. Ever since I was little, his letters, addressed in a bold, almost indecipherable script, had followed my mother from pillar to post like a pack of playful puppies. Depending on where we were currently living, she stashed them in different places, which became more challenging as time went on, given their growing abundance in our shrinking domiciles. At the El Camino Motor Hotel, where we lived for the better part of a year in room 37, she situated them on sheets of newspaper and stowed them under the bed alongside the upturned remains of dead roaches. She told me never to touch her Mac letters, as she called them, but of course I did. They were full of news about his parties. Papa's old moth-eaten kilt was a big hit last night. And hometown people...